This video contains spoilers for portions of Genshin Impact's main story, as well as a side quest or two. If you have not yet finished the Mondstadt portion of the story, unless you are not concerned about spoiling the story for yourself, I recommend you stop here and return upon completion of those events. You have been warned. A little over a month ago, I released a video outlining my theory, explaining my firm belief through supportive evidence that Aether and Lumine were separated initially by 500 years after their encounter with the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles. While developing that theory, one thing really stayed at the forefront of my mind. Why? What was the Sustainer's motivation for interrupting the traveler's journey and then going on to decimate an entire civilization? In order to get into the mind of the Sustainer and derive her possible motivation, we need to first explore the world as it was 500 years ago. I've spent a lot of time exploring the world at my own leisure, and really diving into the possible options, which could have resulted in the cataclysm of 500 years ago. What I've learned seems to dictate that Lumine was not in Celestia, as I initially thought, but now, undoubtedly, in the abyssal moonspire of the Spiral Abyss. We can link the Spiral Abyss to the Ancients by looking to the description of the abyssal moonspire, which is stated as a massive underground city, constructed by an ancient civilization long gone. To this day, the purpose of this underground city remains unknown. The Moonspire today appears to exist out of time, in a state of perpetual night. Perhaps a grim but beautiful snapshot of the devastation from 500 years past. The moon, massive and looming over its surroundings, a reflective floor with circular patterns, strange floating debris, which is possibly a remnant of the Sustainer's wrath, and lastly, these strange blue runes. At this time, I cannot yet determine exactly what these runes are or what their significance is, but as they appear in abundance here, as well as throughout Teyvat's domains, they were clearly meaningful to the now lost civilization. Now, looking back at the moment Lumine first breached the surface from the underground labyrinth of the Ancients, in that now well-known scene of devastation, this scene has stirred the minds of many curious travelers since its first appearance. It has spurred on more than just a few theories, but one of the more common ones I've seen tossed about since then is that opposed to Lumine overlooking the destruction in eastern Mondstadt, as I proposed myself in the 500 years apart theory, it was instead Stormterror's lair, also known as the ruins of Old Mondstadt, once ruled by the tyrant Animo Archon Decarabian. However, 500 years ago, Decarabian was already long defeated, and humanity had abandoned these ruins, moving east following the warm monsoons, giving birth to the current era Mondstadt. Throughout the lands of eastern Mondstadt, there are more than just small relics of the past. There are many dozens, if not hundreds, of destroyed ruins scattered all over, including several pillars which bear a striking resemblance to the ones seen amongst the destruction. The artistry and architecture of the domains scattered throughout Teyvat also displays similar symbology to the ruins of the lost civilization. But I'm not bringing this up simply to refute those claims, but rather to establish a connection between the ruins of eastern Mondstadt and the lost Ancients. Among the most noteworthy of destroyed locations is the Thousand Winds Temple. If you compare the temple ruins to those of Stormterror's lair, you begin to see a stark contrast in design themes. Within the ruins of Decarabian's Old Mondstadt, you see a commonality of a specific style of stone laying, as well as a long and elegant, almost vine-like pattern that outlines many of the structures, including the central citadel of the tyrant himself. Back at that once great Colosseum of the Ancients, if you look closely, you may begin to notice there are very different styles and patterns on display. Swirling tribal patterns and these interlocking ellipses appear all over. Upon further exploration, these elliptical shapes appear not just on the temple itself, but also upon much of the ruins surrounding it. This is by far the densest area of ruins you'll find in eastern Mondstadt. The floors and doorway arches of what were likely once great structures are largely all that remain, with the same elliptical pattern appearing here as well. These patterns are only found thus far in some of the most mysterious locations in Teyvat. The ruins in and immediately surrounding Saltaray, in the lands of northeastern Liyue, the many domains scattered across all of Teyvat, the pillars and floors around where each of the hypostases reside, the Spiral Abyss Gateway, and lastly, they line the floors of the abyssal moon spire. These common forms suggest a clear relationship between what is known to be the ruins of the ancient civilization's underground labyrinth and the structures above ground in eastern Mondstadt today, now lying in ruin as a result of the Sustainer's wrath. But while establishing this commonality is important, it is quite possibly not the most compelling discovery hiding in these ruins. Tucked away in a corner near a rock face are the partially destroyed remains of an ancient sundial, upon which is an inscription, "Seeds of Stories, brought by the wind and cultivated by time." Nearby this sundial is a researcher, Henry Morton. He appears very invested in uncovering the secrets behind this sundial. However, he was at a standstill in his research until after Aether discovered a second sundial on an uninhabited island in the oceans east of Mondstadt. This sundial bears a similar inscription, "Stories brought on the wind will bloom into legends in due time." Together the two seem as if they may be intended to flow from one into the next. Seeds of stories, brought on by the wind and cultivated by time. Stories brought on the wind will bloom into legends in due time. These lines may be a cryptic way of saying that Barbatos, using his common disguise as the bard Venti, sang to the ancients of eastern Mondstadt tales of a long-forgotten archon. But over time, these tales became embellished and grew into legends which elevated the people's admiration of the supposed powers of a now-forgotten god, leading them to worship both archons. If you take the time to explore the uninhabited island's secrets, you'll begin a quest line which involves a number of wind spirits, an altar, and the discovery of a ragged notebook of unknown origin. In it, the writer speculates on his discoveries, mentioning his suspicion of the existence of a god of time, and also its possible relationship with the Animo Archon. He also mentions how the lines inscribed upon the two sundials appear to line up. He does, however, also write that the four lines then deliver the complete message. This may mean that there are two more sundials that exist in the world someplace, and that there are two more lines to this tale which we have not yet seen. Or it may simply mean that the text was inscribed upon the two sundials in 2 rows each. For now, we can only speculate, but from what we can see, a theme of wind and time does appear. So, with that said, what really is the nature of the relationship between the Animo Archon and this tale of the god of time? A ruined civilization, possibly worshipping a god not among the 7 known archons of Teyvat. In a time after the Archon Wars had concluded, Mondstadt's lands have always been largely ungoverned by their Animo Archon, so it is unlikely that he would have interfered in their idolizing of this god. In fact, Barbatos has long since decided that it is in the best interest of freedom that he only interfere in Mondstadt's affairs when absolutely necessary. The ancients built domains which bear the mark of the Animo Archon's Cecilia on their doorways, and prominently at the top of these doorways, a 4-sided symbol, which today is also most notably found resting beneath the spawn locations of the hypostasis. Enemies comprised entirely out of strange elemental cubes. But there is also another location where we might have seen this 4-sided figure, worn by another involved closely with magical cubes. It is easy to miss, as it appears in only a few frames while Aether is attacking the Sustainer, albeit somewhat out of focus. If you look closely at the Sustainer's back, there is a glowing rune on display, which appears to be the same 4-sided figure. From this angle, 3 of the sides are visible. The 4th is a little harder to spot, but inspecting the top from this angle, the 4th prong of the insignia does appear to be there, suggesting a connection between the Sustainer and the insignia on top of the domains. The city of Mondstadt itself has existed much as it has today for over 1,000 years, which can be seen in Genshin Impact's manga. Its first installment explores Mondstadt 1,000 years ago, during the age of the oppressive aristocracy. Fast forward 500 years though, and Mondstadt's lands were under siege by an unknown god, and was somehow unaffected by the devastation. But how could Mondstadt remain unscathed? The ancient civilization's ruins lie so close to Mondstadt. Is it possible that the Sustainer was simply not interested in the people there? Were they not involved in whatever actions the Sustainer found to be so heinous? Or is it more likely that before the City of Freedom could be targeted, Barbatos awakened once more and intervened, preventing the Sustainer's wrath from consuming the city? While Venti slept much of the past 1,000 years, he does mention briefly, in the current day, that he was active in Mondstadt 500 years ago. He goes on to divulge having had some involvement with Nesnaya's cryo-archon, the Tsaritsa, but she broke off all ties with him after this interaction. When he mentions this, he also adds that he wishes the Seven had united against the Abyssal Order long ago. Did Venti attempt to unite the Seven 500 years ago in order to prevent the onslaught of the now returned Archon of Time? Or was he attempting to bring them together after dealing with this Archon himself in an attempt to secure aid in quelling the rising threat generated as a result of the Time God's magic? It is said that the Abyssal Order and the Hilichurls only first appeared in Teyvat sometime around this era. I believe only now are we beginning to ask the right questions, which will allow us to start scratching the surface of the Sustainer's motives. Starting with this, I believe the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles is the God of Time. If the Sustainer does wield the capability to manipulate the fabric of space and time, it would explain how Aether and Lumine ended up 500 years apart from one another after their encounter with her. It would also explain, possibly, assuming that the twins aren't some form of immortal beings to begin with, why Lumine hasn't aged in the duration since. And it could possibly provide clues as to how the Abyssal Moonspire appears to exist frozen in a single moment in time. For this theory to hold water, I have to set the stage to expose the possible chain of events which may have led to the Sustainer's return to Teyvat and subsequent wrath. In the current day, Venti revealed the secret of the Archons to Aether, explaining that all vision wielders are known as allogenes. This word is defined by the real-world Gnostic texts as a half-human, half-divine, capable of communicating with realms beyond the sense-perceptible world, into the unknowable. In Teyvat, those allogenes are capable of ascending to Celestia, and from a certain point of view, could be considered communicating with a realm beyond the sense-perceptible world. This action makes the allogenes eligible to receive a gnosis and become archons themselves. With this established, what if the Sustainer, in the early ages of Teyvat, watched as mankind below her began to claim the power of the gods for themselves? These allogenes then ascended to Celestia and began to challenge her authority. It is likely she would see this as an affront to her role as the sole Archon of Teyvat, and actively attempt to eliminate this annoyance. But outnumbered by the many new Archons, she was sealed away, leaving these new gods to squabble for power and govern the lands as they see fit. The Archon Wars would rage on for several thousand years, and in time would pass. The world began to settle, and the ancient civilization, spurred on by tales told by the Animo Archon, have begun to worship the Sustainer, described as the God of Time in his tales. But as time passed, the stories became embellished legendary tales of the Archon's great power. The ancients began to build large sundials and domains dedicated to their newly appointed god. These would become the instruments through which the great minds of this civilization would work to develop their ultimate goal. Together they would utilize the details of the legends and develop a misguided seal-breaking ritual designed to release the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles from the prison which held her unique powers at bay since before the Archon War began. But when they succeeded, based upon the Sustainer's choice of the word arrogation, they claimed her as their possession, possibly then requesting for her return to the corporeal realm, assistance in dominating the lands of Teyvat, or simply manipulation of the timeline in a way which benefits their society. Enraged at seeing that not only has mankind continued to use the power of the elements to claim the power of the gods for themselves, but have now also had the audacity to attempt to transfer her from the chains of imprisonment to the chains of servitude, she unleashed her power upon them, decimating everything, imprisoning and transforming the inhabitants into creatures unknown before this period. Barbatos would not remain idle for this event. This sudden return of the Archon of Time would be a direct threat to the City of Freedom. Only two other Archons remain in the mortal realm. The Geo-Archon governs Liyue actively, but remains hidden to all Teyvat except for one day a year. He would have no other option. He would reach out to the Cryo-Archon of Nesnaya, the Tsaritsa. But as Venti tells it, we know that the Tsaritsa broke off all ties with him after this period of time. So it is likely that the Cryo-Archon may have viewed Barbatos' methods of governing his own region as deserving of the fate he brought upon his lands, turning him away and refusing involvement altogether for fear of incurring the wrath of the Sustainer herself. Barbatos would have to handle this on his own. Venti knew where the ancients released the Sustainer from her prison, the uninhabited island. Visible from the beach which Aether awakens and finds Paimon, at its center, a stone altar upon which is carved the four-sided insignia of the Archon of Time. I mentioned earlier a ragged notebook found on this island, in which details the span of time between the hours of 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. that is quoted as feeling particularly strange. It goes on to explain that only a vision holder can seemingly unveil the true secret. During the questline which takes place here, in the current day, it seems apparent that the Animo element holds the key to unlocking the shrine which protects the seal, imprisoning the power both great and terrible. I believe that Barbatos squared off here against the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles in a last-ditch effort to reseal her, using the same sealing power that was used against the Sustainer eons earlier. But while he was sealing the Sustainer once more, having had thousands of years to prepare for the possibility of being resealed, the Sustainer of Heavenly Principles utilized her powers of time manipulation to produce a tear in the fabric of space and time, called an echo of her final act of defiance against the Animo Archon. Instead of allowing herself to be sealed away again, without hope of being released, the particularly strange feeling between 2 and 5 a.m. is actually the tear in time, providing a window into the moments of her doomed battle with Barbatos. Through this window, those capable of communicating with the realms beyond the sense-perceptible world might become curious enough to peer inside, allowing for the possibility of her release. Barbatos, successful in resealing her on his own, but realizing that this occurred, left the ruins under the care of an Animo spirit to help prevent it from being explored too deeply. In fact, this would explain why, during the questline where its presence is revealed, it flees from the island, whilst leaving behind a clear path to follow in order to lure you away from the altar, as its destruction at that site, during the hours that the tear in space and time is perceptible, would bring the Sustainer one step closer to release. There the Sustainer remains, but it is only a matter of time. She knows that it is an inevitability. The arrogation of mankind is eternal. It will perpetuate its need to claim that which is not their own. And there we have it. The Sustainer may in fact be the god of time, and was sealed away by the Archons of the past, only to be released by the misguided ancients, resulting in their untimely destruction. Only through the involvement of the Animo Archon was she sealed and Teyvat spared from their would-be fate. What do you think of the God of Time? Do you think the Sustainer and this mysterious god could indeed be one and the same? I'd love to hear your thoughts on it in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and don't forget to click on the bell icon so that you are notified when my next video goes live. Lastly, join the Teyvat Historia Discord server to discuss Genshin Impact's lore, mechanics, or even exchange your theories with other community members. Thanks for watching Teyvat Historia. May the 7 guide you, travelers.